Hello, in Dateline London, our discussion this week, well into the fourth week of the Middle East war. Can the proposed UN resolution, as drafted, really end the fighting? Or does a more intense and wider conflict now threaten? Plus, is the Bush administration right to assume that President Castro's hospitalization for stomach surgery signals the beginning of the end of communism in Cuba? Well, joining me today, Baria Alamuddin, who is correspondent for the Lebanese newspaper Al Hayat, Sharon Sadeh, political analyst, former security and London correspondent for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, Michael Goldfarb from the American radio station WBR in Boston, and Ned Temko, chief political correspondent for The Observer. Welcome to you all. Well, the US and France have agreed a draft UN resolution to end fighting. It could be passed in New York as early as Monday, but Lebanon rejects it as a recipe for more confrontation. Hezbollah says it's meaningless unless Israel withdraws and halts all attacks on Lebanon. Israel is cautious. Well, Baria, what's your analysis of the Lebanese skepticism at the moment?
Well, obviously, they are right to do that, to have that feeling. Lebanon is suffering from a huge humanitarian crisis. What they need first is a halt and a cessation of all fire from both sides. So
but why the caution about the language at the moment?
Yes,
that's what it's designed to produce.
Yes, exactly. The cautious is because it does not address main points, which are the exchange of prisoners, which is the Shib'a Fund, and also it leaves in position the Israeli occupation forces that have occurred in the last 20 days. So especially that last point, because if you leave these forces inside Lebanon, then you are literally giving Hezbollah all it needs to say that I am fighting the occupation.
Does the Lebanese government have any power, any will to stop Hezbollah fighting? That's part of the resolution, immediate cessation by Hezbollah of all attacks.
I think the Lebanese government has always had the will. The power is another story, and that is why we were having a dialogue that was taking time. It was difficult, but they were having it nonetheless.
But my question is, can they stop Hezbollah, the government in Lebanon?
No, I think the situation now is changing on the ground. I think what has happened in the last 23 days has changed things inside Lebanon. Although now you see support for Hezbollah inside the country because they're seen as being fighting the Israelis. Nevertheless, once this fighting stops, you're going to see another dimension.
Sharon Sadeh, you said no way.
No way at all. I think that the past 2 or 3 years, even the past 6 years, suggested that the Lebanese government is incapable of restraining Hezbollah in any effective manner. And I also think that what we would see now is a very long period of instability within Lebanon, because this war inflicted a lot of damage and also raised many question marks about the stability of the political system there. And I also think that the Israeli forces will not intend to stay in Lebanon for a long while until the arrival of a multinational force, whatever that would be. I also think...
It was 18 years the last time.
Yeah, I think that the Israelis learned their lessons.
That was a long time.
I also need to... This is a very unique situation we are now facing. I think it's the first time that the international media has witnessed what does it mean to have an asymmetric warfare, in which...
In other words, inequality.
It's not inequality. It's the deliberate use of civilian population as a tactic to shield militia forces within it. This is something that recalls
by Human Rights Watch.
Right, but Sharon, I need to come to you because I've asked for a Lebanese view about Israel.
Yeah.
The draft resolution says an immediate cessation by Israel of all offensive military operations. You are a political and security and defense analyst. What is a defensive military operation which would still be permitted by this resolution?
I think that the draft is still, it's not formalized as yet, and also I do think that the word immediate is not really included.
I'm worried about offensive and defensive.
In Israeli terms, there is no real difference between defensive and offensive.
So it's meaningless.
It's mainly preemptive. And should the Israeli Defense Forces, the intelligence community, feel that they have an imminent threat, they will do whatever they can in order to eliminate it. And therefore, I don't see, until we have a meaningful force, international force, that will separate, will be a buffer zone, effective buffer zone between the Hezbollah militia and Israel, we won't see any real cessation of hostilities.
But just to be clear, the chiefs of defense in Israel will be scoffing at this, saying, well, actually, we can get away with everything because it's defensive, everything we're doing.
They can scoff or not. It's entirely up to them. What I do think that they will not take any international criticism unhindered. I think that Israel will try to obey any UN resolutions to the letter, as they did with the 5059 and the previous resolutions. But also I do think that the international community needs to address the issue of asymmetric warfare, because the international law and the international media are not really geared to cope with this kind of situation.
Right, let me bring Michael and Ned in. Here we have demands for a new UN resolution. It's almost 2 years since 1559, which everyone is now citing, all remaining foreign forces to be withdrawn. What hope should we have for a UN resolution? Ned?
Well, I mean, I hate to turn the clock even further back, but I was a young war correspondent in Beirut in 1978 when there was an earlier UN resolution which also said the Lebanese army goes to the south, it created UNIFIL, and the short answer is resolutions don't matter. What matters is the political will, the balance that is reflected in resolutions.
Should we be skeptical, Michael?
Yes, skeptical of the whole situation. I think that, yes, the pictures from Lebanon in particular have galvanized first world opinion. We have to make everybody stop. But the UN really doesn't have the power to separate these people out. And how do you create this buffer zone to insert a 20,000, 30,000, however many thousand strong group to police that area? The rubble of South Lebanon is essentially the homeland of Hezbollah. And unless you're going to turn the whole place into a thorough demilitarized zone with no human beings living there, how can any group manage to suppress Hezbollah? Because this is their homeland. This is where they come from.
So wouldn't be the natural answer is let's solve this problem.
Well, except, I mean, to be fair, I mean, I almost feel sorry for the diplomats. I think the aim, palpably, of this resolution is they know they can't sort it out in the next 24 hours. And ironically, this first stage resolution, I think, was a response to this kind of pressure, immediate ceasefire and whatever, to see whether you could cobble together some words that just might, for a while, allow a ceasefire, allow humanitarian aid to go in. And indeed, interestingly, the Downing Street focus is, I mean, Blair was yesterday talking, yes, to world leaders. He also talked to Oxfam. And the British role that is envisaged is, if you can stop fighting for a while, you know, get food, get various other
Am I too cynical then to use the word tokenism, almost using it as a kind of way of saying we're doing something, but we know it can't be enough?
But can I say something?
Well, can you answer that first?
Yeah, sorry, what
Is it tokenism then on the political front, getting this new resolution?
Yes, absolutely.
Is that the feeling you have?
Yes, some of it is, because it's not addressing the actual issues. What we need to do is to stop the killing first and then go on talking. You know why?
But how do you
because
stop
this
the
is
killing?
taking time.
You cannot really uproot.
Yes, can I just say something? What you need to do is have a complete ceasefire on both sides. So to everybody, just stop the killing, because this is not sustainable. Killing Israelis and Lebanese
I'm
every
very
single
sorry,
day is not sustainable.
Right.
We
I
know
do-
that
I do
solutions are
think-
taking time.
Whether we stop it now, I do think it just will see another round of violence. Not now, but in 6 or 12 months. You need to have a more comprehensive solution to this issue.
Absolutely.
And I do think that unless you have a sovereign state that is a functioning state up the northern border of Israel, you won't have any long-lasting peace and quiet on that front. I also think that the fact that the UN are now relying on some kind of multinational force, and we all know that previous examples suggested that any international force completely failed in Somalia, in Mogadishu, in Rwanda, even in Lebanon before. They tried and failed. I don't think that any American or French or Italian soldier would sacrifice its life for the sake of the Lebanese or the Israelis. I don't think it should.
Sharon, this is what I've been saying since this was first mooted. UN forces do not give their... We remember Srebrenica, and we know that you simply cannot expect a foreign soldier to lay down his life for the defense of Israel or for the defense of the Lebanese. It's absurd to think that this can in any way. And then there are other things in this resolution which will all be ignored. I mean, the pressure being put on the Lebanese government, which is barely a year old. Everybody was so excited, yes, we're going to finally have democracy back in Lebanon. how can you expect Fouad Siniora to insert an army into this enclave, even if it's been reduced to rubble, turned into Grozny by the Israeli Defense Forces? You can't expect that, any more than you can expect Lebanon to, in some way, develop a political system that excludes Hezbollah.
Do you agree with that?
No, I don't.
Well, does the Lebanese government have the capacity to put an intervening Lebanese
yes,
force there?
if this humanitarian and crisis that it finds itself in, don't forget what we have here today. Every single day there are people getting killed. The Lebanese government cannot actually concentrate on its efforts to exactly to have its authority amongst all the Lebanese if it has to deal every single day with the death and destruction of the country
But Baria, a
systematically.
month ago it wasn't in that position.
Fine, but the longer this war is going to do, the worse the situation is going to be, not only in Lebanon, but also in the area. You know what is this doing? This is actually putting together and bringing together all the icons of jihad in the area. Are we here ready to create another Iraq, another Afghanistan? Are we ready to see?
Happen
No, sorry, not let it happen. You and I are sitting here.
by the inaction of the Lebanese government throughout the years, by the fact that they allowed the foreign forces to allow a militia to be armed and trained by Iran and by Syria, by kidnapping Israeli soldiers, by violating international law, by creating and doing international human rights crime, by the fact that there is no way that you can restrain Hezbollah, and although jihad is only by force and by power. Therefore, we go back to the old adage of deterrence, of balance of power in the Middle East, and this is what would probably bring some stability but no peace.
Let me shift on to Ned Temko, because you've written 3 pages today in your paper, The Observer, talking about the dilemmas of the politicians led by Tony Blair here in Britain. But you talked as well about the challenge now for the humanitarian organizations and him talking to them. Here we have yesterday in Junieh, the port north of Beirut, the bombing by the Israelis of the last exit or route to bring humanitarian supplies in. What is your feeling about how powerful or powerless the international politicians feel?
I think they feel, what they've discovered is that there are huge limits to military power. That is, Israel has extraordinary conventional superiority on the battlefield, but is politically vulnerable. Equally, I mean, Sharon's absolutely right. This is a new kind of war. And the frustration for the Israelis, no doubt, and Jounieh as a target is a good example. Politically, it is hard to understand. It's a Christian area. It risks alienating people who have previously been Israel's allies. On the other hand, if you're in the operations room in Tel Aviv and say, how can one keep supplies, resupply of Katyusha rockets coming from the north, you say, hit this bridge. And that's the frustration for people like Baria caught in between.
But what about the politicians like Mr. Blair? I mean, he seems to have been sidelined a bit at the United Nations. The French and the Americans have taken over. He's postponed his holiday. But what about the frustrations of the politicians faced with this military reality on the ground?
I think they're huge. And I think what will come out in the next week is that of all the phone calls that Blair has been making, despite, for instance, a fairly testy Newsnight appearance by Fouad Siniora, most of them, the most significant ones, have been to Siniora. And most, if you read this ceasefire resolution for what it's worth, the core of that is Siniora's 7 points presented in Rome. And it's interesting, I think Blair and Siniora, I mean, the British role will be very much through trying to empower the Lebanese government. Will it work? Very, very difficult.
It was interesting at the press conference that Blair had. Sorry, can I just make this point before I lose it? At the press conference, the last press conference with Blair, I was there on Thursday, and it was interesting that many of the journalists attending that press conference were calling on Tony Blair not to interfere because he's seen as being too much sided with the Americans and the Israelis, that he has lost his credibility as being fair to both sides. Also, I think it's interesting that point that Blair also is seen as allying himself and